In the year 1279, in the town of Saint-Maximin, buried deep in the limestone of Provence, a young monk knelt in the crypt beneath a crumbling church. His name is lost to us now, but his moment is not. The candle in his hand threw trembling shadows across the ancient stone floor. He had been commanded by Charles II, Prince of Anjou, nephew of the King of France, to excavate this exact spot. The prince had dreamed the night before, a dream of a sarcophagus, hidden for centuries, containing bones that would change the world. The monk's fingers, slick with cold sweat, traced the edge of a stone slab. He pried it up. The air that rose from the darkness beneath was dry and old, carrying the scent of dust that had not been disturbed since the Roman Empire collapsed. He lowered the candle. And there, in the flickering light, he saw them. Bones. Human bones. And a skull. The monks who rushed into the crypt behind him fell to their knees, because carved into the stone sarcophagus, barely legible, was an inscription. It said, "Here lies the body of Mary Magdalene." That skull, lifted from the crypt in 1279 by trembling hands, is still with us. It rests today in a golden reliquary in the Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, a Gothic church built specifically to house it. The skull is small, yellowed with age. The top of the cranium is visible above a delicate golden mask that covers the face, as if shielding something too sacred to be looked upon directly. Every year, pilgrims climb the stone steps of that basilica. They cross themselves. They weep. They press their hands against the glass. They believe, with absolute certainty, that they are standing inches from the actual physical remains of Mary Magdalene, the woman who stood at the foot of the cross, who watched Jesus die, who walked into a tomb on the third day and found it empty, who became, in the oldest Christian tradition, the apostle to the apostles. 745 years after that candlelit discovery, science finally asked a question that faith had never dared to ask. Can DNA settle this? Can a single strand of hair, pulled from a skull that millions have venerated, tell us who she really was and what really happened to her? The answer would shock the Vatican. It would electrify geneticists, and it would open a door that the Catholic Church has spent centuries trying to keep closed. To understand what that DNA revealed, and why it matters so profoundly, you have to understand the journey that brought a Jewish woman from Galilee to a crypt in southern France. And you have to understand that for 2,000 years, her story has been one of the most contested, the most rewritten, and the most explosive narratives in all of human history. Let's go back, not to 1279, but to the beginning, to a fishing town on the shores of the Sea of Galilee called Magdala. The year is somewhere around 30 CE. A woman named Mary, Miriam in her native Aramaic, lives in this town. She is known as Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene, to distinguish her from the other Marys who fill the pages of the New Testament. What we know about her from the earliest sources is remarkably consistent. She appears in all four Gospels, in Matthew, in Mark, in Luke, in John. She is present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples have fled. She watches Jesus die. She follows his body to the tomb. And on the third day, she returns to that tomb alone, or with other women, depending on the account, and finds it empty. She is the first person to see the risen Jesus, the first to speak with him, the first to carry the news of the resurrection to the other disciples. This is why the early church called her Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles. She was the one who brought the message to the messengers. What the Gospels do not say is almost as important as what they do say. They do not call her a prostitute. That claim, the one that has defined her in art and literature for 15 centuries, does not appear in any biblical text. It was invented in the year 591 CE, when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon conflating Mary Magdalene with an unnamed sinful woman from the Gospel of Luke, and with Mary of Bethany. 3 separate women, fused into one. A single sermon, spoken from a pulpit in Rome, rewrote her identity. The Church would not officially correct this error until 1969. For 14 centuries, Mary Magdalene was portrayed as a repentant prostitute, a fallen woman redeemed. But the Gospels never say that. What they say is that she was a close follower of Jesus, that she was present at the most critical moments, and that she was the first witness to the resurrection. So what happened to her after that? The canonical Gospels go silent. The Acts of the Apostles mentions her briefly, then she disappears from the authorized record. But the silence did not last. Stories began to circulate. Traditions began to crystallize. And one of the most persistent and powerful traditions pointed west, across the Mediterranean, to the coast of what is now France. The legend, documented in the Golden Legend, compiled by Jacobus de Voragine around 1260, tells a story that is breathtaking in its audacity. After the crucifixion, the early Christian community in Judea faced persecution. Some of Jesus' closest followers were rounded up. Among them were Mary Magdalene, her brother Lazarus, her sister Martha, and a man named Maximin, who would become the first bishop of Aix-en-Provence. According to the legend, their persecutors did not execute them. They did something stranger. They put them in a boat without oars, without sails, without a rudder. They pushed that boat out into the eastern Mediterranean and left them to the mercy of the sea. The expectation was that they would drown. But the boat did not sink. It drifted, caught in currents that pulled it west, through the straits, past Sicily, past Sardinia, until it finally washed ashore on the southern coast of Gaul, at a place that would later be called Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, the St. Mary's of the Sea. When Mary Magdalene stepped onto that beach, she was in a foreign land, surrounded by people who spoke a language she did not know, worshipping gods she did not recognize. She was, according to the tradition, in her late 40s or early 50s. She had survived persecution, a sea voyage that should have been impossible, and the loss of everyone she had known, and she did not stop. She began to preach. She began to convert the pagan Gauls. She became, in effect, the first Christian missionary to what would become France. But the preaching did not last. The legend says that after some years of this work, Mary Magdalene withdrew. She retreated into the mountains, to a cave high in the cliffs above the plain of Saint-Maximin, a place called Sainte-Baume. She lived there for 30 years. 30 years in a cave. Alone. In silence. In prayer. The grotto at Sainte-Baume is a real place. You can visit it today. The cave mouth opens onto a sheer rock face, looking out over a forest that stretches to the horizon. Inside, water drips from the ceiling. It is cold. It is remote. It feels, even now, like the end of the world. When she finally died, according to the tradition, she was buried in the plain below, at a site that would eventually become the town of Saint-Maximin. Her body was placed in a sarcophagus. The location was remembered, and then, as the centuries passed, it was forgotten. Until 1279, until a young monk, following the dream of a prince, lifted a stone slab and saw bones that had been waiting in the dark for over 1,000 years. Charles II of Anjou was a man of immense political ambition and genuine religious fervor. When he claimed to have discovered Mary Magdalene's tomb, he did not hesitate. He declared the remains authentic. He ordered the construction of a great basilica to house them. The Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume rose from the Provençal earth, its Gothic arches soaring, its crypt designed specifically to hold the sarcophagus and the relics within it. The skull was placed in a golden reliquary. The tibia, a bone from the lower leg, was displayed separately. Pilgrims began to arrive. They have never stopped arriving. But here is where the story fractures. Because Saint-Maximin is not the only place that claims to hold Mary Magdalene's bones. 300 kilometers north, in Burgundy, the Abbey of Vézelay had been telling a different version of the story for centuries. According to Vézelay, Mary Magdalene's body was transferred from Saint-Maximin to Burgundy in the 11th century to protect it from Muslim raiders. The monks of Vézelay claimed they had the bones. They built a magnificent Romanesque basilica around them. For hundreds of years, Vézelay was the primary pilgrimage destination for those seeking Mary Magdalene. Kings came, popes came. The abbey grew rich and powerful on the basis of this claim. Then, in 1279, Saint-Maximin announced its discovery. The French crown backed Saint-Maximin. The pope was caught in the middle. Two churches, both claiming to hold the same woman's bones. The conflict was never fully resolved. Vézelay's relics were eventually discredited. But the abbey still stands, and some still believe. But wait, the story gets even more tangled. The Orthodox tradition holds that Mary Magdalene never went to France at all. In this version, she traveled with Mary, the mother of Jesus, to Ephesus, in what is now Turkey. She lived out her years there, died there, and was buried there. The city of Ephesus was an important early Christian center. It had strong connections to the Apostle John, and if Mary Magdalene was there, Her bones would have been destroyed or lost in the chaos of the centuries that followed. The Persian invasions, the Arab conquests, the Crusades. And there is yet another claim. Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital, now Istanbul, claimed that Mary Magdalene's bones were moved there in 899 CE by the Emperor Leo VI. They were placed in the Church of the Holy Apostles, alongside the supposed remains of other biblical figures. When the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, many of those relics were looted, scattered, lost. Some ended up in Western churches, some were destroyed, some simply vanished into the fog of history. Which brings us back to the skull in the golden reliquary in Saint-Maximin. 4 competing burial sites, 4 conflicting traditions, and no way, until very recently, to test any of them. The Vatican has always been cautious about relics. The official position is that relics are aids to faith, not objects of scientific scrutiny. The Church does not require believers to accept the authenticity of any particular relic. Multiple relics of the same saint can coexist without contradiction in Catholic theology, because what matters is the devotion they inspire, not the bone itself. But that theological nuance has not stopped the faithful from believing, and it has not stopped scientists from asking questions. In 2016, the questions finally reached the skull itself. A French geneticist named Gérard Lecout had been studying ancient relics for years. He had worked on the Shroud of Turin. He had analyzed hair from Egyptian mummies. He was one of the few specialists in the world with the expertise required to extract genetic material from objects that had been handled, kissed, and prayed over for centuries. And he was given access to something extraordinary: 3 hair samples from the Reliquary of Mary Magdalene at Saint-Maximin. The hairs were carefully removed from the golden mask that surrounds the skull. They were transported to Lecout's laboratory under sterile conditions. And then he began the delicate, painstaking process of extracting DNA. Ancient DNA analysis is not like the genetic testing you see in commercials. It is monumentally difficult. DNA degrades, it fragments, it gets buried under layers of contamination from every person who has ever touched or breathed on the sample. Relics are among the worst candidates for DNA analysis in the world, precisely because they have been venerated. Thousands of pilgrims, hundreds of priests, centuries of handling. The skull at Saint-Maximin has been displayed in the basilica since 1295. For more than 700 years, people have been in its presence. Their skin cells have drifted onto it. Their breath has settled on it. If Lecout could extract anything from those 3 hairs, it would be a minor miracle. But he did extract something. He isolated mitochondrial DNA. This is the genetic material passed down exclusively from mother to child, generation after generation. It does not tell you everything, it cannot identify a specific individual, but it can tell you something crucial: the deep ancestral origin of the person whose hair this once was. Where did their maternal line come from? What population did they belong to? The result that came back was haplogroup K. Haplogroup K is a mitochondrial lineage that originated in the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean roughly 30,000 years ago. It is common today in populations with Middle Eastern ancestry. Among first-century Jewish women living in Judea, haplogroup K was one of the typical mitochondrial signatures, along with haplogroups HV, T, and R0. If you were going to test the DNA of Mary Magdalene, an actual Jewish woman from first-century Galilee, haplogroup K is exactly the kind of result you would expect to find. The hair did not belong to a European woman. It did not belong to a medieval French peasant whose bones had been mistaken for a saint. It belonged to someone whose maternal lineage traced back to the Middle East. Lecout published his findings. The news made headlines around the world. DNA analysis suggests Mary Magdalene relic has Middle Eastern origin. Verily of the Wasters. Science may confirm 2,000-year-old tradition. Vividly. The skull of Saint-Maximin speaks. But then the question started. Lecout's study, when subjected to peer review, raised concerns. The sample size was small, 3 hairs. The methodology was not fully transparent. The results had not been replicated by an independent laboratory. And mitochondrial DNA, while powerful, has limitations. Haplogroup K, while consistent with Middle Eastern ancestry, is not exclusive to it. It is also found in parts of Europe, particularly in populations with ancient Near Eastern admixture. A person buried in medieval France could, in theory, carry haplogroup K without ever having set foot in Judea. The study, in other words, was suggestive, intriguing, but not conclusive, and no comprehensive follow-up has been published since. The skull remains in its reliquary. The hair samples remain unexamined by other labs. The Vatican has not commissioned a larger study. The French Catholic Church, which oversees the basilica, has been cautious about authorizing further testing. Why the caution? Because DNA testing of relics is a trapdoor. Once you open it, you cannot control what falls through. Consider the broader landscape of relic DNA studies. Scientists have attempted similar analyses on other Christian relics, and the results have been mixed and explosive. The Shroud of Turin, the most studied relic in history, has been subjected to pollen analysis, carbon dating, and genetic testing. A 2019 study by Barbacino and colleagues identified pollen grains on the shroud that are native to the Middle East, particularly the region around Jerusalem. DNA fragments extracted from the fabric showed both Middle Eastern and European maternal lineages, consistent with an object that originated in the Levant and then spent centuries in Europe. And yet the carbon dating, conducted in 1988, placed the shroud's origin in the medieval period. The conflict between these findings has never been resolved. The shroud remains, officially, unexplained. The bones of Saint Nicholas, the historical figure behind Santa Claus, present another case. In 2017, a researcher named Sulo compared the bones held in Bari, Italy, with bones from a tomb in Turkey that some believe to be the original burial site of Nicholas. The analysis found that the bones matched, same individual, two separate locations, both claiming to hold the real Saint Nicholas, and science confirmed that the bones came from the same person. But did that prove they were Saint Nicholas? No. It only proved the bones were consistent. Identity could not be established from bones alone. Fragments of the true cross have been even more difficult to analyze. Wood degrades. DNA from wooden objects is almost impossible to recover after centuries. Most fragments tested have yielded no usable genetic material. The ones that have are so contaminated that the results are meaningless. This is the dilemma that the Vatican faces with Mary Magdalene's skull. Advancing technology means that a full, rigorous, independent DNA study could very likely be done. Nuclear DNA might be recoverable. Whole genome sequencing might be possible. And what would that reveal? If the DNA definitively shows Middle Eastern origin, Jewish ancestral markers, first-century dating consistent with a woman from Galilee, then the Saint-Maximin tradition gains powerful scientific support. The Vatican would have to grapple with the implications. A relic, scientifically validated, becomes something more than a relic. It becomes evidence. But if the DNA shows European origin, if the skull belongs to a medieval woman, perhaps even a local, with no genetic connection to the Levant, then the Saint-Maximin claim collapses. 700 years of devotion, undermined. The basilica becomes a monument to a mistake. The pilgrims who have wept before that golden reliquary will have been weeping before an anonymous skull. And if the DNA is inconclusive, which is the most likely outcome, given contamination, degradation, and the limitations of ancient DNA analysis, then the status quo is preserved. Nothing changes. The mystery remains. The faithful continue to believe. The skeptics continue to doubt. The Vatican, which has navigated these tensions for 2 millennia, can continue its careful policy of neither confirming nor denying relic authenticity. This strategy of studied ambiguity has served the Church well. Pope Francis, who elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day in 2016 to the same liturgical status as the Apostles, has shown more openness to science than many of his predecessors. Under his papacy, the Vatican Observatory has expanded. The dialogue between faith and science has been emphasized. But on the specific question of the Saint-Maximin skull, Rome has remained silent. And there is another layer to this mystery, a layer that has nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with theology and power. Mary Magdalene has become, in the last 50 years, one of the most contested figures in Christian history. The Da Vinci Code and other works of popular fiction have seized on her image. The Gnostic Gospel of Mary, a 2nd-century text discovered in the late 19th century, portrays her as a disciple who received secret teachings from Jesus, teachings that the male disciples, particularly Peter, resented. That gospel, which the Church did not include in the biblical canon, has fueled centuries of speculation about her true role in the early Christian movement. Was she a leader, a teacher, a rival to Peter, Some have even suggested, without historical evidence, that she was married to Jesus. These theories, however speculative, have massive popular appeal. They resonate with modern audiences who are drawn to the idea of a suppressed feminine voice in early Christianity. The Vatican, for its part, has not engaged directly with these claims. But the elevation of her feast day in 2016 was widely seen as a quiet acknowledgement of her importance, a reclaiming of Mary Magdalene for Orthodox Catholicism, on the Church's own terms. The DNA testing introduces a new variable into this already complex equation. If the skull at Saint-Maximin can be scientifically linked to a first-century Middle Eastern woman, the French tradition gains a credibility it has never had before. It would mean that the story of Mary Magdalene's journey to Gaul, the boat without oars, the cave in the mountains, the 30 years of prayer, cannot be dismissed as pure medieval fantasy. It would mean that something real lies beneath the legend, and that would have profound implications for how we understand the spread of early Christianity. It would mean that the first missionary to France was not a man sent by Rome, but a woman sent by shipwreck, a witness to the resurrection who carried the message across the sea herself. But notice the limits of what DNA can do. Even if the genetic testing were perfect, even if it proved beyond doubt that the skull belonged to a Jewish woman from the 1st century, it would not prove that the woman was Mary Magdalene. It would only prove that the skull is consistent with her. Identity cannot be extracted from a mitochondrion. The name Mary of Magdala cannot be read in a sequence of nucleotide bases. The DNA can tell us who the woman might have been in terms of her population, her ancestry, her deep origins. But it cannot speak her name. It cannot tell us what she saw on the 3rd day outside a tomb in Jerusalem. This is the fundamental limitation of the entire enterprise. Science can narrow the field of possibilities. It can rule out frauds. It can confirm consistency. But it cannot replace faith. And that, perhaps, is why the Vatican is not panicking. The Church has always understood that relics are signs, not proofs. They point toward something. They are not the thing itself. Still, the questions persist. The hairs are there. The skull is there. The technology exists. Somewhere, in a laboratory, a geneticist could be running those samples right now. Gerard Lucat showed it was possible. His haplogroup K finding, for all its limitations, opened a door. Someone, eventually, will walk through it. And in the meantime, the skull sits in its golden reliquary in the basilica at Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume. The light filters through the stained glass windows, casting blue and gold patterns on the stone floor. Pilgrims climb the steps. They pause before the reliquary. They look up at the small yellowed cranium, the fragile bone that has survived empire and revolution, fire and flood, 7 centuries of human touch. Some of them know about the DNA study. Some of them have read the headlines. Some of them have wondered, in the quiet of their own minds, whether the woman whose bones these are would recognize the world we have built around her. A basilica, a golden mask, millions of pilgrims, scientific papers, controversy, legend. Would she recognize herself in any of it? The woman from Magdala, the fishing town on the shores of Galilee, who walked through the dust of Judea behind a teacher from Nazareth, who stood in the shadow of a cross while the sky went dark, who stumbled into a garden tomb at dawn and found the stone rolled away. We cannot ask her. The bones do not speak in words, but they speak in other ways, in carbon, in isotopes, in the mitochondrial lineages carried silently across generations from mother to daughter, from the Near East to the shores of Gaul. The skull is still there. It has been there for 700 years, but now, for the first time, science has spoken. If you want to see the next reveal, subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.